Amen. Well, when was the last time you found yourself afraid? Maybe this morning, maybe this week. Maybe there's a lot of things that come to your mind. Maybe there's certain fears that are pressing in on you. I find it so encouraging that in our Bible, we're told over 365 times by God to not be afraid. Do not fear. And I love this because it validates the fact that we will feel fear. God isn't saying, if you feel fear, you should be ashamed because you're afraid, because you shouldn't be afraid. But instead, by telling us, do not be afraid, God's telling us, when you feel afraid, I don't want you to live afraid. I want you to not be afraid. You see, God knows that there's plenty and ample reasons in this world for us to be afraid, but he doesn't want to leave us there. I think it is because we all feel fear, that we all love a good hero story. Do we not? Like, just look at the movies that are out, the books that are written. How many of them are dedicated to having a hero? Someone who steps in at the darkest hour, someone who has incredible courage to fight the battle on behalf of others and rescue the people, or in the superhero world, to save the world again and again and again and again. We love a good hero story, and I think one of the greatest hero stories ever written, that it's ever happened, has to be David and Goliath. Believe that because every other epic hero story is described as a David and Goliath story, right? And when we see a David and Goliath story, or we see it play out on a football field or a baseball field or in life in general, who do we cheer for? David, unless your team's the giant and you're like, no, we're the good guys. We cheer for David because we love the underdog. We love for him to topple the giant. Today, as we see a familiar story in the story of David and Goliath, I want to invite us to see God's invitation to choose faith over fear. See, last week we kicked off a series on the life of David. We said over these next couple of weeks, we're going to see that David came from being a shepherd. He was anointed last week, and was told he will be king. And ultimately, as we look at the shepherd king, we want to be reminded again and again and again how David's life is a foreshadowing of the greater king who is one day to come. Last week, I encouraged us to look at the story of David and ultimately the story of that we find throughout the Old Testament, not in 2D, but in 3D. Not looking to each individual character, each individual hero that's put before us and go, what does this mean for me? How am I supposed to respond to this? And for David, not to look at David and go, well, how do I need to be more like David? That's looking at it in 2D. In 3D, we look from David and say, what is David's life? What is this telling us and pointing us to about Jesus? And from Jesus, what it tells us about Jesus, from there, we determine what it says about our life. Because what God is doing is he's not putting before us David as some person to follow. He's a foreshadowing of the one day, the person who would come to fulfill what David would not be able to do. You see, this graphic, we did some work this week, is actually in 3D. Anybody got the 3D glasses? Good. Didn't think so. Hope not, because it's not 3D. Can't do that. But here's the deal. As we look at this story today and every week over the next couple weeks, I want you to look for Jesus. How is David going to point us to Jesus? And how is that going to challenge us in our own lives? You see, David is going to turn out to make some of the biggest mistakes that any human being can make. And last week, somehow, for some reason, we saw that God looked beyond the outward appearance and said, what I want most is a heart that's committed to me. Not a person who's going to be perfect, but a person who's going to repent when he's wrong, who's going to come back when he strays, who's going to trust and seek forgiveness when he messes up. That is the heart that God seeks in David, which is encouraging to us because that's a heart that you and I can seek to cultivate and a heart that we can have. You see, we often think when we look at this Old Testament and these stories that God is after perfect people, but God came because there was no perfect person. Perfection came to pay the price for the imperfection that sin has caused. And therefore, a heart that repents when it sins is the very heart that God is after. It's the invitation he gives to you and me. So as we come to this story, the story of David and Goliath, there are no plot twists. The story ends as you would expect the story to end, right? David is going to kill Goliath. But as we look at this familiar text, can I ask you and invite you to see what God has for you, not to follow David, but to see Jesus. Last week, when David was anointed king by Samuel, we recognized and pointed out the fact that Samuel came to anoint David king, but there was a problem. What's the problem? There's already a king. And kings that are reigning typically don't take too kindly to other kings being told that they're going to reign in their place. And so can you imagine, as Samuel leaves and goes, oh, well, have a nice life. You see David and his family looking around like, I think this should probably stay a secret right here. Like, let's not tell everybody what's happened or what Samuel has said, because that would be dangerous for us. Because if Saul catches wind, because Samuel was afraid of Saul, how much more so do you think David would be afraid of Saul? You see, what's interesting is in that space, in that time, Saul, we're told, in the second half of chapter 16, is going crazy. You see, whenever God's Spirit leaves, something will always fill its place, and it's never good. We're told that through his disobedience, God withdrew his Spirit from Saul and took the kingdom from him. God didn't reject Saul. God rejected him as king. But in that space, Saul begins going crazy, and his court looks around and goes, we got to do something. And somebody comes up with a brilliant idea. Let's find somebody who can play music that can soothe Saul when he gets agitated. And so someone goes, I got somebody. There's this boy in Bethlehem. Go get him. And so Saul sends this message to David's dad and says, 1 Samuel 16, verse 19, therefore Saul sent a message to Jesse and said, send me David, your son, who is with the sheep. Now, in light of what has happened, how do you think Jesse received this message? What do you think Saul is asking for David for? If you're Jesse, knowing what you have seen, we don't know how long it has been. I think, if that's me, I'm thinking Saul has caught wind of what's happened. He's asked for David because he wants to kill him. And faced with fear here, we see Jesse helpless. He can't defy the orders of the king. He can simply send David to Saul as requested and hope for the best. He's helpless. David goes, and David finds great favor in the eyes of Saul. In verse 21, and David came to Saul and entered his service, and Saul loved him greatly, and he became his armor bearer. And Saul sent to Jesse, saying, let David remain in my service, for he has found favor in my sight. Look at what God's doing. I'm going to anoint a king, and I'm going to have that king that the other king, the current king, doesn't know about, request that the future king would come and serve him. If you have ever any question about who's writing the story, it can only be God. In those days, as David is serving Saul, the Philistines rise up, and the Philistines are going to come and fight the Israelites. And so somehow at some point, we don't know how long, David goes home, and he's not with Saul because Saul isn't home. Saul is at the battlefront with his army. In those days, two armies would line up, oftentimes find high ground, and you prepare for battle. And battle would happen when the armies would march towards each other, and it was incredibly gruesome. Because in those days, it was not uncommon for in a battle of two great armies to have like 20,000, 25,000 men die in one day. It was horrific. And so they would line up and they would wait in a valley like this. This is the valley, Elah Valley, which is the valley that you can go to today. You can walk through this valley. It's the valley where the battle of David and Goliath happened. And if you see on the top left, it says the Philistine camp. They're on the far side, and then the Israelite camp's on this side. Each army is in their hills, and in this valley is where they would come, and the battle's going to happen there. But instead of one army marching in, one army decides, instead of us all moving, we got a better idea. We're going to identify a champion. So rather than thousands of people die, let's risk one of our lives and one of your lives, and let's send out a champion who's going to fight on our behalf. That champion is the one we know as Goliath. In verse 4, it says, and there came out from the camp of the Philistines a champion named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits in a span. He had a helmet of bronze on his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail, and the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. And he had bronze armor on his legs, and a javelin of bronze slung between his shoulders. The shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his spear's head weighed 600 shekels of iron, and his shield bearer went before him. We know this as Goliath, the giant. But it's interesting to note that this is the longest description of military attire in the Old Testament. What is the author doing? What is the author communicating? The author wants you and I and the readers, especially in that day, to understand and to know beyond a shadow of a doubt what he was describing. He's describing a warrior who is invincible. He stands between 9'6" and 10 feet tall. His armor, this mail that's described here, weighed over 125 pounds. The steel head of his spear, javelin, weighed 15 to 20 pounds. This guy was huge, and not just that, not just the weight of all that he has, the armor that he has, it's metal. The Israelites don't have anything metal. We're told at this time, it's likely that the Israelites had 2 swords in the entire nation because the Philistines had conquered them before, taken everything away and every blacksmith that existed. So if they needed something sharpened, they would need to go to the Philistines to have it happen. So to describe this guy in conjunction with those people, and you see an impossible obstacle. You see, what's interesting is that this comes right on the heels of what we just saw last week in chapter 16, where God said, hey, you look at the outward appearance, but I look at the heart. What's described here with Goliath? Only the outward appearance, nothing about his heart. What we find here is an object lesson following up on the theology lesson we saw in chapter 16. Not only is his appearance intimidating, his words are utterly demoralizing. Look at verse 8. He stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, why have you come out to draw up for battle? Am I not a Philistine and you're not servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourself and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us. And the Philistines said, I defy the ranks of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together. When Saul and all the Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. Fear. We find it again. But before we jump to Saul and the Israelite army, can I suggest that I think that what we find here with Goliath is a man who's afraid. You see, one response to fear is to control, is to banish your fear, reject it, deny it's even there, to visualize success, to describe what you're going to do and know that it's going to happen, and to assert control. I believe Goliath has stuffed his fear by protecting himself and attacking those around him to intimidate them. And it works. We're told that Saul and his army are afraid in verse 11. You see, remember, Saul in himself was a tall man. He was over a head taller. He stood at 6'6". He was a head taller than any other person in the Israelite nation. He was the big guy. He was the strong guy. He was exactly what we would want in a king. He was the one who would fight on our behalf, who would defend us. Because remember, when the Israelites asked for a king, they wanted a king who would do what? Fight their battles. And so in this scene, the champion emerges. And where do you think everyone's eyes look? Saul. Surely our king. He is going to go and fight on our behalf, right? Wrong. What does Saul do when he's afraid? He hides. He runs. At the same time that Saul is hiding, the army is afraid. When they are faced with fear, they are left to simply hope. Hope that somebody would get the courage, somebody would have the strength, somebody would have the will to step in and fight the battle that nobody else wanted to fight. And this happens not once, not twice. This happens for 40 days, and not just 40 days, twice a day. 80 times Goliath has come out and said these things to the Israelites. And I'm guessing he had a whole repertoire of insults that he used, intimidating the Israelites. And it works. Nobody moves. And so David is going to come back into the story. And in verse 17, and Jesse said to David his son, take for your brothers an ephod, this parched grain, these 10 loaves, and carry them quickly to the camp, to your brothers. Also take these 10 cheeses to the commander of their 1,000. If you see your brothers are well, and bring some token from them. We know from the previous verses that 3 of Jesse's sons are in battle with Saul, which means 4 sons are at home. Earlier in Scriptures in Numbers 1, it describes to us that anyone over the age of 20 would go to battle. So we are led to believe that 4 of Jesse's sons are less than 20, obviously including David because he's the youngest. We have seen David twice since his anointing. First, he's playing a harp for Saul, and here he's essentially a DoorDash delivery boy for his father. Neither of those is a great description of a king. And here, I think, is a great reminder to us who may find ourselves waiting on God's promises. God's calling is often accompanied by waiting. God's promises are often accompanied by waiting. What we consistently see is that our waiting, though, is never wasted. In David's waiting, it is in the pasture that God is preparing David for the plans that he has for him in the future. And it's in our waiting, rather than being impatient and restless. I wonder what it would look like for us to use the waiting time as a preparation time for what God has in store. It is in the pasture that David plays his harp. He practices his sling. His heart is prepared and his faith is cultivated. You see, David reminds us that believing in God's promises also means trusting in God's timing. That is incredibly easy to say, much harder to practice. If you are in a season of waiting, I'm guessing you have battled fear there. What if things don't work out? What if God doesn't provide? What if God has forgotten his promise? Or what if God has decided to bless or use someone else? You see, in this season of waiting, David arrives, and he's not feeling sorry for himself. What he brings is a fresh perspective to what others have seen for the last 40 days. It says he arrived early in the morning in time for Goliath's first appearance that day. And in verse 24, the response to Goliath once again berating them is that all the men of Israel, when they saw the man, Goliath, fled from him and were much afraid. There it is again, fear. But David shows up. As David shows up and sees, here's what Goliath says, and sees how the army is responding. Check out how David speaks, and this is what's interesting. If you got your Bibles, I would star this. 1 Samuel 17:26 are the first words we have in the Bible spoken by David. We've heard a lot about him. We've seen a lot happen around him, but these are the first words he says, and he says this to the men who stood by him. What shall be done for the man who kills the Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? You see what happens? David walks up. He walks into this place where everyone else is fleeing and everyone else is afraid. But David looks at two things. He looks at the true identity of Goliath, and he looks at his great offense. His true identity, he calls him out. You uncircumcised Philistine. What is he saying? He goes, wait a second. I know him. He is not on our team. He's not on God's team. He is not one of us. And who are we? We are God's people. That should give us courage. And in addition to identifying Goliath's true identity, he also calls out his great offense. It's not that he's fighting against the Israelites. It's not that he's picked the wrong team. It's what he has said about the Israelites and about the Israelites' God. He's committed a capital offense. He's defying the armies of the living God. According to the Torah, Leviticus 24, any individual guilty of blasphemy, even a non-Israelite, should be stoned. Ironic, isn't it? Based on how the story is going to end. David shows up, and he's not allowing the current circumstances, the current obstacle, and the current fears to cloud what he believes to be true. Saul has put before the army an opportunity. He says, anybody who kills this Philistine, anyone who kills Goliath, what am I going to do? I'm going to give him riches, I'm going to give him my daughter, and I'm not going to tax him for the rest of his life. Saul is reaching deep into his bag, begging for anything that will motivate people to step out into the battlefield and take on Goliath. Yet David shows up and goes, it's not about the horizontal. It's not about motivating me to give me something to do it. It's about remembering who I'm fighting for. While the army can only see an impossible task, David remembers that God, his God, does impossible things. So here, I want to pause. Because I think there's a truth that we need to be reminded of here. Have you ever noticed how easy it can be in our Christian circles and in our Christian bubbles to sit around and bemoan how far our culture has shifted and how far our culture has gone, and how we have strayed from God's best and following God's will and honoring God as a people. You see, if the size of our fear somehow changes the power of our God, like because of what's happening around us, somehow God is wringing his hands and unable to be in control and unable to remain God today. You see, when this happens, our focus shifts, like the Israelites, from the vertical, who God is and who we are, to the horizontal of what's happening around us and what we have to do. When this happens, we cease to remember who God is and what he has promised, and we become overwhelmed by the hostile threats all around us, somehow thinking the battle we are engaged in is a battle we can't win. I see this among Christians. I feel this in my own heart when it comes to the cultural climate and the current events around us today. You see, when the culture is pulling away from what God created and what God has commanded, and God's Christians wring their hands and isolate even more from the evil world out there, we're missing it. You see, in times like these, God, I believe, identifies and calls and raises up outsiders, much like David, who can show up in the overwhelming circumstances and see them through the eyes of an unstoppable promise. Instead of looking back to the good old days, instead of thinking how good it was back then and how hard it is right now, what would it look like for God's people today to recognize the same God who was God then is the God who's God now? And remember this, that you were not created to live 50 years ago, 100 years ago, 200 years ago. God created and ordained for you to be living today, which guess what? When we look at the culture and the world around us, God created and has called his people to this moment and this time, which means you and I are uniquely gifted and empowered by God to be his people today, which means there's nothing outside of us that should overwhelm us. Or should our hearts break at sin? Absolutely. Should we ask the question of how God wants us to engage with it? Absolutely. But it is not on us to feel overwhelmed by it or think somehow the world is too far gone. God has called us to this moment and this time and this place. What may seem like an unstoppable cultural force around us is no match for our undefeatable God. So can I invite you to show up and to see the world through the eyes of David, fresh eyes that haven't been jaded by the circumstances. He simply said, I know who my God is. And I know what my God does. What's interesting is David shows up with a spirit of optimism. And do you know where he receives the greatest pushback? His brother. Check out verse 28. Now Eliab, his great eldest brother, heard when he spoke to the men, and Eliab's anger was kindled against David. Now, why would Eliab's anger be kindled against David? I think the root of his anger is probably fear. Because he knows that if what David is saying, if the truth that he's proclaiming, Eliab knows is what he's grown up with and what he's understood and what he's believed his whole time, what he knows has been challenged by what he's seeing. And he knows that if David's right, then the only right response is to step into battle, and he doesn't want to step into battle because he's afraid. So look at what he does. He does what all good brothers do. He's going to insult his brother and talk down to him. Why have you come down? And with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? He's belittling him. Those few sheep, yeah, your job means nothing. You are worthless. You watch a couple sheep in the wilderness, big deal. Did you find someone to babysit them for you? And he goes, I know your presumption and the evil of your heart, for you've come down to see the battle. You don't have a dog in this fight, David, because you can't fight. Therefore, you've come to stand on the side and then challenge us to go in the battle for you. I know your presumption and the evil of your heart. Ironic, because last chapter we heard about his heart. We heard how God viewed David's heart. And David said, what have I done now? Like I brought you lunch. Was it not but a word? I'm just asking a question that I think is really valid. David's courage and truth speaking, touched the insecurity of his brother and caused him to be angry. But word traveled beyond Eliab, got to Saul, and in verse 31, when the words that David spoke were heard, they repeated them before Saul, and he sent for him. And David said to Saul, "Let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight this Philistine." And Saul said to David, "You're not able to go against the Philistine to fight with him, but you are but a youth, and he has been a man of war from his youth." Rightfully so, this young teenager walks in and says, "I'll go." And Saul says, "No, you will not," based on two criteria: who you are, David, and who your opponent is. Who you are, just a kid. Who he is, a mighty, mighty warrior. But guess what? David responds, and he's not going to look to who he is and who Goliath is. Instead, he comes pointing to something greater. In verse 34, but David said to Saul, "Your servant used to keep sheep." I love this. When was the last time David was watching sheep? That morning. And he's using past tense. Like way back when, he's already seen it. Like, I'm out of here. I'm no longer a shepherd, right? He's going, "You ever described your circumstances?" "Yeah, long time ago, long time ago, like yesterday, I was doing such and such, or I struggled with such and such," right? No, he says, "When I used to keep sheep," as in this morning, "when there came a lion or a bear and took a lamb from the flock, I went after him and struck him and delivered it out of his mouth. And if he arose against me, I caught him by his beard and struck and killed him." Do you know what's close to the beard of a lion or bear? Its mouth. "Your servant has struck down both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, for he's defiled the armies of the living God." And David said, "The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine." And Saul said to David, "Go, and the Lord be with you." Saul pointed to who David was and who Goliath was as reason for David not to go into battle, but David shows up and doubles down on his offer based on two things: his experience of what God has done and his belief in what God can do. When you and I find ourselves uncertain and afraid, one of the greatest gifts we have is the testimony of God's faithfulness in the past. Again and again, God brought his people to places, gave them feasts and festivals for the sole purpose of looking back and remembering. Remember what I did. Remember what I did. Because he knew we'd get to junctions in our life where we would face fear, and one of the best gifts he could give us is his faithfulness in the past, and go, "I don't change. If I was faithful back then, you can trust me to be faithful in the future." David is sitting at this incredible fork in the road, and he goes, "Hey, I'm moving forward because I know what my God has done, and if he's done that, then I know what he can do." It's a picture of faith in the face of fear. Saul, you know the story, tries to give David his armor, but it won't fit because we said Saul's 6'6", and David is just a teenager. It's like a kid wearing his dad's clothes where the arms are just flopping all around. David's like, "I can't go into battle like this." So what does he do? He picks up his sling and a staff. Now, I don't know what you think of when you think of a sling. Maybe you've seen a picture before, but this is a picture of one of the slings that David may have used. Sometimes they have leather on them. Sometimes they're just braided. But this was not like a child's toy. This was a military weapon. And Judges, we hear about 700 warriors who were sling throwers and could throw a rock at a hare and not miss. It was believed that sling throwers were more dangerous than archery people when it came to military warfare because of what they could do and the damage they could inflict from such a great distance. This was not a child's toy. This was a weapon. When used correctly, a stone from a sling could be hurled at a rate of 100 to 150 miles an hour. That would hurt. This is what David carries into the battle. And in verse 41, we get the battle. And the Philistine moved forward and came near to David with his shield bearer in front of him. And when the Philistine looked and saw David, he disdained him, for he was but a youth, ruddy and handsome in appearance. And the Philistine said to David, "Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks?" And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. And the Philistine said to David, "Come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and to the beasts of the field." Goliath insults David because Goliath feels insulted. He sees David coming at him, this boy with a stick and some stones, and goes, "Where's the glory in this for me? If I defeat you, you're not even a warrior. I don't get any credit for this." And he curses him, insults him. This is what we today call trash talking. And David is not going to be left behind. He steps right into the battle, And he has his own talk to give. In verse 45, then David said to the Philistine, his battle cry, you come to me with a sword and with a spear and with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. And I'll give the dead bodies of the host of the Philistines this day to the birds of the air and to the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all this assembly may know that the Lord saves, not with the sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hand. Notice, if you have your Bible in front of you, what David says. He comes first in the name of the Lord. He's not coming in his name. He's not saying, I'm David. Nowhere does he mention his name. He's mentioning God's name. And he declares what God will do. This day, the Lord will deliver. He doesn't say, I will deliver. He states what will be known. All of the earth will know the name of David, and I will become king. No. All the earth will know the name of the Lord, and then the Lord, that there is a God in Israel. All the world will know Israel's God. And he knows whose battle it is. It's not his. He says the battle is the Lord's. Goliath is disgusted at the lack of glory he will get, while David is motivated by the glory God will be given. And the battle unfolds. As the Philistine moved closer to attack him, David ran quickly towards the battle line to meet him. Reaching into his bag and taking out a stone and slung it and struck the Philistine on his forehead. The stone sank into his forehead and he fell on his face to the ground. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and with a stone and struck the Philistine and killed him. There was no sword in the hand of David. Then David ran and stood over the Philistines and took his sword and drew it out of its sheath and killed him and cut off his head with it. When the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they fled. The hero is victorious. The villain is dead. These David and Goliath stories are what we all love. So let me ask you a question. What's the point? What's the point of this story? That David wins by overcoming his fears, conquering his fears, and slaying the giant? Is the point that you and I can be like David and slay the giants in our lives? Is the point that we should look at our fears, call them Goliath, and say the bigger they are, the harder they fall? Do we look at this story and go, what Goliaths do we have that we need to slay? I think if you take that as the meaning of the story, you're simply looking at the story in 2D. You're simply looking to David as an example to follow. But this story is so much more than that. I think we understand a little bit more the point of the story when we ask another question. Where do you find yourself in the story? Which characters do you resonate with? Where are you in this story? We've seen all these people afraid. We've seen Jesse, we've seen Goliath, we've seen Saul, we've seen the army, we've seen his brother, and I'm guessing David himself was afraid, or he wasn't human. Who do you associate with? Can I invite you to look maybe where you may not first think you would find yourself in this story? With the Israelite army. You see, the Israelite army is frightened. The Israelite army is afraid. And what does God do for those who are frightened and afraid? Thankfully, our God doesn't give us an example and say, hey, go fight like him. Hey, go be more like them. Have courage like them. You see, God doesn't give us an example. God gives us a champion. Someone to fight for us. Tim Keller shares God's response to those who are frightened this way when he says, God doesn't deal with their fears through intimidation and emulation. He deals with their fears through substitution and imputation. Now, He doesn't deal with their fears by giving them a pep talk and going, you can do it. And he doesn't deal with their fears by giving them an example. Hey, follow him. The Israelite army, they don't go looking for slingshots and go, hey, go fight like David. Instead, God deals with our fears and their fears through substitution, someone who fight for us. You see, a champion wasn't just some idea. It wasn't just a description. It was a legal term. You see, what a champion did on behalf of his people was given to them. His victory was granted as a victory to all of them. The story starts by Goliath saying, if I win, you'll be our slaves. If you win, we will be your slaves. Basically, the champion steps onto the battlefield with the hopes and dreams of the entire nation with them, knowing that if he wins, they all win too. It's not an example. It's a champion that goes out before the Israelite people. And it's a champion that you and I need. Think for a second about your greatest fears. I don't know what comes to mind. But I know behind every fear is the greatest fear and the most invincible enemy in our world, death. When we look at death, we recognize that every single person is going to die. It's an enemy that you and I cannot conquer. More protected and more invincible, it seems, than Goliath in that day with his armor and his size. And it's that enemy that God sent Jesus into the battle against. Jesus steps into the valley, goes into the battle as our champion, not our example, but our champion who's going to fight on our behalf. And in the garden, on the night before Jesus would go to the cross, he does battle with fear. We're told that he sweats drops of blood because he's so in such anguish, not because of the physical torment that he is going to endure going to the cross, which is going to be absolutely astronomically excruciating, but because of the spiritual experience he was about to step into. He knew that the greatest fear that he would ever face, that anybody could ever face, was the reality of being separated from God. He knew that when he went to the cross, there would come a time when God would turn his back on Jesus. And that absolutely overwhelmed Jesus to the point where he's begging, is there any other way? To which God says, no, it's the only way. It's the only way for them, for you and me, to get past that enemy. Because death is going to claim every single one unless you beat it, unless you conquer it for them. And so Jesus, in his weakness, steps into the battle and goes to the cross. And he dies as our champion, paying the debt for us. His victory over death when he walks out of the grave is now given to us if we believe and trust in him. You see, today, because of what Jesus has done, the finished work we sang about earlier, we do not fight for victory. We fight from victory. Does that mean we don't face battles? Absolutely, we face battles. In this room, we can line up and share the battles in which we are facing today. Maybe it's marriages, maybe it's our kids, maybe it's our finances, maybe it's jobs, maybe it's depression, maybe it's addiction. You fill in the gap. There are battles being waged all around us because the Bible tells us we're living in war. But we do not fight that war wondering if we will win. We fight that war knowing our champion has been victorious. And the only thing that would motivate Jesus to go to the cross and would give him the courage to take that step and do that, make that sacrifice for you and me, wasn't that he simply pulled up his bootstraps, buckled his sandals, and walked to the cross. It's that he saw the joy that was set before him. The author of Hebrews, in Hebrews 12:2, says, looking to Jesus, we follow him, our example, our champion, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. Wait a second. How do you get joy connected with this shame and connected with the cross and torture and death? How does joy fit in the same sentence? It's joy because Jesus looked past that to what he was purchasing. He was purchasing you and me, our eternal destiny. And because of what he saw on the other side, he was able to step into this battle. And today he invites us with the joy set before us of eternity that will one day come, knowing that death has been defeated and can never have a hold on you and me who trust in him, for the joy that we have, knowing that no matter what comes in our way, that is our future destiny and the victory is assured. He says, walk with joy, walk with courage. Not because you have a God who gives you an Old Testament full of examples in which to follow, but because you have an Old Testament that points us to the one champion who would one day come and fight your battle for you. That is who we trust. That is who we come to with our fear. That is the one who fights for us. And so this morning, I don't know where you are, but as we saw in the story of David, I know exactly who our God is. I know what he's done, and I know what he will do. And so I want us to end by confidently, by faith, declaring this same battle cry that David declared when he stepped into the battle of Goliath. Because his words can become our words as we put our faith in our good God in the midst of our fears. So, I'm gonna need your help. I need you to stand. I'm gonna put these words on the screen. I'm gonna read them. And then I want you to repeat them. And now remember, we're going into war. Right, so we're not going to whisper a war cry. We're going to declare it. And as we declare this, then we are going to declare it in song that this is not our battle, it is his battle. This doesn't negate the battles you're facing, but it gives you victory in the midst of them, knowing who has already fought on your behalf. So let's speak the words that David spoke to Goliath. You come against me with the sword and the spear and javelin. Maybe I wasn't clear. We're going into war, right? We don't mutter, we don't whisper. We're going to declare what's true. So I'm going to read it, then you're going to declare it. You come against me with sword and spear and javelin. You come against me with sword, spear, and javelin. But I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty. The God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands. And I'll strike you down and cut off your head. And the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. And the whole world will know there is a God in Ackworth. And all those who gather here will know that there is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves. For the battle is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hands. Let's sing.